Snow fell like silent ghosts on the forgotten plains, where the wind howled with a wild, desperate fury. In the flickering lantern light of a run-down cabin, a young widow clutched her newborn triplets, close her heart heavier than the storm raging outside. Abandoned to die in the blizzard by those who deemed her life unworthy. Mary Addison believed there was no salvation until the silhouette of a lone cowboy appeared through the icy gloom. Little did she know this stranger would change the course of her life and ignite a story of grit, passion, and redemption that no frontier legend could overshadow. Mary Addison had once known peace. It was a simple kind of peace, the sort found in a content heart and a modest homestead. She remembered the early days with her late husband, Frank Addison, on the outskirts of Redwood Springs. Not more than 20 families lived in the entire region, scattered across the wind-swept plains. They'd married young and built a life out of little more than raw grit and unwavering faith. But tragedy had a way of creeping in like a thief at twilight. Frank died in a ranching accident when a spooked horse kicked him square in the chest. Mary, then pregnant, bore the weight of grief alone. She continued her work, cooking, sewing, and trying to maintain the small piece of land they had. Yet the promise of new life stirred within her, and she clung to hope for her unborn child. Fate had other plans. Instead of one baby, Mary gave birth to 3. Upon hearing the cries of the triplets for the first time, she felt both elation and dread. She feared for how she might feed and care for all of them alone. Redwood Springs was a small settlement, and Mary had few allies there. The saloon was run by the cantankerous Harriet Briggs, who took advantage of any vulnerable soul that wandered inside. A handful of ranchers dotted the region, including the influential Baxter family, but none of them had shown interest in helping a widow with children. For Mary, the future was a bleak mystery. What Mary didn't know was that Frank had accrued a series of debts before his death. Driven by desperation in the final months of his life, partly due to drought, and partly to feed Mary, he had struck deals with the unscrupulous Sam Baxter. Sam was a rancher, with an appetite for power, eager to buy up or force out struggling neighbors to expand his own land. Unbeknownst to Mary, Frank had signed over the rights to their property as collateral. If Frank couldn't repay the debt by winter, the land would revert to Sam Baxter. The winter came viciously that year, blanketing the plains in a sheet of ice and snow so thick it appeared endless. Cattle died by the dozen, and homesteads struggled to keep enough feed for their animals and enough firewood to stave off the killing cold. All the while Mary tried to feed her children on next to nothing. Every day the triplets Joseph, Jacob, and little Rebecca demanded more than her poor larder could provide. With no father, no extended family, and no means to settle Frank's debts, Mary found her life closing in around her. The few neighbors who once offered friendly gestures now shrank away, unwilling to shoulder the burden of her misfortune. The final blow fell one frigid dawn when Sam Baxter rode onto her property with 2 hired hands. He demanded the land, brandishing the agreement Frank had signed. "Your husband promised me this place if he couldn't pay up," Sam told Mary in a tone as cold as the wind. "Reckon you and those young'uns best be packing your things." Mary pleaded for time, just a few more weeks, enough to figure something out. Her hands shook, her voice trembled, but Sam Baxter's stony glare didn't soften. "You got till the sundown, Mary. But even that's an act of mercy." He turned his horse in a sharp pivot, and the trio rode away, leaving the widow with her triplets and a mind swirling with dread. The blizzard began that afternoon. Snow drifted in howling gusts around the Addison cabin, piling up against the door, sealing the windows in frigid whiteness. Sundown was near, and Mary's fate was sealed. She had to leave. Gathering what few possessions she could carry, a worn carpet bag with the children's spare blankets, and a photo of her wedding day, she strapped each infant to her chest and hips with tattered shawls. Then, bracing herself against the gale, she stepped outside onto the swirling, frozen earth. When the door closed behind her, she knew this might be the last time she'd see the only home she'd known since marrying Frank. The wind cut through her threadbare coat like knives, and for a moment she almost turned back inside. But Sam Baxter's warning lingered in her head. She pressed forward. Her instincts told her to head toward Redwood Springs, though it was nearly 7 miles away. A mother's desperation can outmatch even the fiercest storm, and Mary summoned that raw courage as she trudged on, not knowing that the next day would bring a stranger who would change all their lives forever. Redwood Springs might not have been a bustling metropolis like Dodge City, but it had a main street of sorts, a dirt road flanked by a few wooden buildings, Harriet Briggs's saloon, the bank, the blacksmith's shop run by Bill Henderson, and an old church that rarely saw a congregation in such weather. Mary hoped to reach at least the saloon. Harriet Briggs might have been sour and calculating, but she wouldn't refuse a mother holding 3 newborns on a lethal winter night, would she? Staggering through chest-high drifts, Mary pushed forward, teeth-chattering arms already numb. Her mind wandered to the memory of her own mother's hands, warm, calloused, always offering a gentle touch. Her mother was gone now, passed away in a distant town. Mary half wished she could see her again, even if only for some last-minute advice on how to survive a blizzard with triplets. She made little progress. Each step felt like scaling a mountain. The triplets swaddled beneath her coat, whimpered softly, dangerously cold. Mary realized she might never reach Redwood Springs. She looked around wildly for any source of shelter, a stand of trees, a barn, any windbreak that could shield them from the relentless force of the storm. With all her might, she forced herself onward. Unbeknownst to Mary, Sam Baxter's hired men had followed her trail to ensure she left the Addison property for good. In Sam's twisted mind, if Mary perished in the blizzard, no one would dispute his claim on the land. He'd even get some measure of revenge for Frank Addison's stubborn attempts to hold on to the ranch. These men roughnecks named Earl and Fitch lingered at the far edges of Mary's tracks, eyes squinting through snow and swirling shadows. "Reckon we let her freeze to death out here?" Fitch asked, voice muffled by a bandana. Earl shrugged. "Sam's orders says not to get involved. Just make sure she ain't turning back." Their breath steamed in the cold air, and for a moment, both men considered the morality of leaving a mother and her 3 babes to die. But Baxter's coin had a way of silencing conscience. They continued their vigil, keeping just enough distance so Mary wouldn't suspect their presence. Inside Mary's mind was a whirlwind of regrets. She recalled the day she'd tried to persuade Frank to give up the ranch and move to a safer town somewhere with more people and resources. "We could sell and start over," she'd pleaded. But Frank, proud to a fault, insisted the land was their legacy. Now with her boots soaked and toes numb, Mary wondered if that obstinacy had led them all to ruin. Pain shot through her legs. Her vision blurred. At the top of a small rise, she collapsed into the snow, arms stiff as iron rods around her babies. They would die if she didn't find shelter soon. Her heart pounded each beat, echoing her frantic desperation. She had never imagined the end of her life like this, freezing on an open plain, with her children mewling for warmth. When her consciousness flickered, Mary was jolted awake by the memory of a name whispered in Redwood Springs. Wyatt Earp had once passed through town. Folks said chasing outlaws or chasing a dream no one quite knew. Stories about big legends sometimes brought hope to these lonely parts. Hope that a hero could arrive in time to save the day. But the plains were silent and merciless. Even Wyatt Earp's ghostly rumor offered no solace. Her strength gave out. The triplets' cries merged into a distant hum, and darkness pulled Mary into its cold embrace. For a moment, she thought she saw movement ahead, a lantern glowing in the swirling snow. But the image blurred and vanished as she finally succumbed to exhaustion and slid into unconsciousness. Earl and Fitch, from their vantage point, noticed the widow slump forward. They exchanged uneasy glances. "It's over," Earl mumbled. He turned his horse and they galloped away, unwilling to watch the final moments of a mother's desperate fight against nature. What none of them could have expected was that someone was indeed wandering these plains, someone who'd been trailing an elusive herd of mustangs, someone guided more by the restless spirit in his chest than any real destination. A cowboy named James Jack Wilson, known to a few folks around Dodge City for his unwavering sense of honor and uncanny skill with horses, was riding through the storm, searching for shelter himself. The swirling winds tore at his dark coat and brimmed hat, and his horse's mane was flecked with frost. He had no inkling that just ahead lay a woman half buried in the snow cradling 3 infants, and that he alone stood between them and a frozen grave. Jack Wilson was no stranger to hardship. Born the youngest son in a family of 6 out in Missouri, he'd grown up with little more than a patch of land and a constant hunger. As soon as he was old enough to sit in a saddle, he'd run off to chase wild mustangs and sign on to cattle drives across the territories. Along the way, he'd heard tall tales of famous lawmen, outlaws and gunslingers, names like Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, and Wyatt Earp swirling in the dusty saloons from Kansas to Texas. Jack never aspired to be a legend. All he wanted was enough work to keep him moving and feed the next dream. He was riding with his head tucked low, leading a pack horse behind him. The storm was the worst he'd seen in years. His breath froze on the ends of his mustache, and his hands, clad in worn leather gloves, were numb around the reins. He kept going for lack of any better plan, hoping he'd stumble on a barn or a deserted line shack where he could ride out the tempest. Then out of the corner of his eye, he caught a shape in the drift, something small, dark, half hidden by snow. He nudged his horse closer, heart pounding from a spark of dread. Jack had come across frozen travelers before, though never with infants. That was a sight that chilled him more than any wind ever could. He dismounted quickly, stumbling as his boots sank into knee-deep snow, and hurried to the figure. Sure enough, it was a woman with 3 tiny bundles strapped around her, each eerily still. For a second, Jack feared the worst, that all 4 were gone. But as he brushed snow off the woman's face, he sensed a faint breath against his gloved hand. She was alive, though barely. One of the babies whimpered, and the sound was so pitiful it squeezed Jack's heart like a vice. Without hesitation, he scooped the woman into his arms, shawls, babies, and all, and carried them back to his horse. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Arrow, snorted at the sudden load, but held steady. Jack gathered the family as securely as he could across his saddle, praying the rope harness he rigged would keep them from tumbling off. He had to find shelter fast. The nearest place was Redwood Springs, if memory served him right, about 2 miles further north. 2 miles in a raging blizzard felt like 20, but it was their only chance. Jack pressed on. Every so often he'd speak words of encouragement to the unconscious woman, though he doubted she could hear him. He told her about the Mustangs he'd been tracking about the ranch he hoped to buy one day. Anything to keep himself from sinking into despair as the swirling white seemed to close in from all sides. The triplets let out weak cries, which at least meant they were still alive. When Redwood Springs' faint outline finally appeared through the storm, a shape of battered buildings along a single street, Jack nearly shouted with relief. He knew a livery stable stood on the south end of town. If it was open, that'd be their best bet. Otherwise, he'd have to kick down a door and pray no one shot him before he explained why he was there. A single lantern flickered outside the stable. By some miracle, the stable master, an older man named Chester Holloway, was awake. He was tending to the last of his shivering horses when he spotted Jack stagger in. Chester recognized Jack from a previous visit, maybe half a year earlier. "Good Lord," Jack Chester exclaimed. "Who in tarnation?" His eyes widened at the sight of the unconscious mother and children. "A widow, I think," Jack managed through chattering teeth. "I found her on the plains. Need a warm place. Now." Chester helped Jack carry them inside. The stable smelled of straw, horse sweat, and leather, a far cry better than the howling freeze outside. They set the mother and her babies on a thick bed of hay near the forge. Chester roused his wife Maggie from their small room adjacent to the stable, and she brought Quilt's water and a few rations. Together they checked the infants, warming their small, blue-tinged hands. Mary was barely responsive, her face pale as a ghost. Maggie pressed a mug of warm broth to her lips. In that moment, Jack realized something profound. He'd never felt such urgency to save a stranger's life. He'd seen many a tragedy on the frontier, but something about this small family, huddled together against death, roused a protective fire in his soul. He found himself praying softly the words, stumbling out in a voice unused to pious recitation. "Come on, lady," he whispered, leaning close to Mary. "Don't you dare leave those little ones alone in this world." Outside, the blizzard's rage intensified, but the stable provided a fragile bubble of safety. Jack and Chester stoked the forge to keep the stable warm, while Maggie did her best to feed the infants a mixture of warm milk from the stable's lone goat. Hours crept by. Mary eventually stirred her eyes, fluttering open, to behold the face of an unknown cowboy. She tried to speak, but only a ragged gasp escaped her lips. "Shh," Jack murmured. "It's all right, ma'am. You're safe." With that, Mary closed her eyes again, exhaustion overcoming her. For the moment, the widow and her triplets had cheated death. The question loomed in Jack's mind. What now? The following morning broke with sunlight so bright it seemed to mock the destructive storm of the night before. Snow glistened like powdered diamonds across the street of Redwood Springs. Inside the stable, Mary awoke to the creak of wood and the soft whinny of horses. A heavy quilt covered her and warmth radiated from the forge's embers. It took her a moment to piece together what had happened. She remembered her desperate trek, the swirl of snow, and then someone found her. She sat up disoriented and checked for her children. The triplets lay beside her, swaddled with surprising care in fresh blankets. A rush of gratitude overwhelmed Mary. They were alive. Then she noticed the cowboy who had saved her. He sat on a small stool near the stall elbows on his knees, hat tipped back. He was young, maybe a few years older than she, with a ruggedness that suggested he'd spent more time outdoors than in. When he saw Mary awaken, he stood and tipped his hat in a polite greeting. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Glad to see you up." She looked at him, eyes wide. Her voice trembled. Who are you?" "Name's Jack Wilson," he answered, offering a small nod. "I was out riding looking for stray mustangs after the storm, and I came across you and your little ones." He paused, uncertain how to continue. Finally, he said, "I did what anyone would do." Mary tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. Jack hurried forward, steadying her with a gentle hand. Overcome by emotion, Mary nearly burst into tears, but she forced herself to keep calm. She had to think of her children first. Maggie Holloway bustled over holding a tin cup of warm broth. "Drink this, honey. You had us right worried." Mary took the cup with unsteady hands. She muttered a shaky thanks and sipped. It tasted of vegetables and a hint of salt, and it was the best thing she'd had in days. "Your babies seem healthy enough," Maggie added, her tone motherly. "I fed them some goat's milk since you needed rest. They'll be fine, but I suggest you get some real food in their bellies soon." Mary nodded. The fear that had tormented her, the possibility of losing her children, subsided somewhat. But in its place came another dread. She was penniless, homeless, and in a town where nearly everyone had shut their doors on her. And Sam Baxter would surely want to finish the job of claiming her former land. Jack watched the worry flicker across Mary's face. He'd seen that look before in his younger sister, after she lost her husband to a fever. It was a look of desperation, of standing at the edge of a cliff with no rope. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you need help, I don't have much, but I can get you situated with some supplies, maybe a ride to another town, if that's what you want. Or if there's family to go to." Mary swallowed the lump in her throat. "I have no family," she whispered. "This was my home, Redwood Springs. My husband died, left me with debts to Sam Baxter. I tried to get to the saloon for help, but the storm—" She trailed off, tears now threatening to break free. Maggie clicked her tongue in sympathy. "That Sam Baxter is a wicked man," she muttered. "He owns half the land around here, and he's always looking to own more." Chester Holloway stepped in, setting down a small breakfast of fried eggs on a tin plate. "Why don't you eat something, Miss Addison? We'll talk afterward." Mary was touched that he remembered her name. She nodded gratefully. As Mary ate, Jack brushed down Arrow in the next stall, giving mother and children a modicum of privacy. He felt a strange stirring in his chest, something akin to protectiveness, but laced with more than mere pity. It was as if an invisible cord bound him to Mary Addison's plight. After the meal, they gathered to discuss her immediate needs. Maggie suggested Mary stay in the stable's spare room for a few days while the weather improved. Chester, despite being crotchety at times, agreed, partly because Jack offered to pay for the room, and partly out of common decency. Mary tried to protest Jack's generosity. She'd never been one to accept charity, but one glance at her fragile triplets made her swallow her pride. She found herself nodding. "Thank you," she murmured, eyes downcast. "I'll find a way to repay you." Jack simply nodded, not wanting to press the issue. For him, the notion of leaving Mary and her children alone in Redwood Springs felt wrong. If Sam Baxter was half as vile as local gossip claimed, Mary would be in grave danger the moment Jack left. Yet Jack was just a drifter, with a few dollars to his name, living job to job. He wasn't looking to settle down. He told himself he'd stay just until Mary was safe, maybe a week or two at most. But fate had a different plan. Already in the hush of that stable destiny, had begun weaving a new thread into both their lives, one that would bind them closer than either could imagine. Life in Redwood Springs moved slowly, except when it came to gossip. Within hours, word spread that a mysterious cowboy had rescued Mary Addison from near certain death. Some said he was a bounty hunter. Others claimed he was a wandering gun for hire. Harriet Briggs, the saloon owner, took a particular interest. She was known for collecting bits of information and turning them into currency. She traded among locals with all the subtlety of a coyote lurking near a chicken coop. Mary ventured out cautiously to purchase a few supplies with Jack's money, flour, dried beans, and a little sugar. The children needed clean cloth for diapers and new booties to protect their tiny feet from the cold. Every step Mary took along the snow-packed street felt laden with suspicion. Onlookers whispered and stared. While some pitied her, others resented her for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Perhaps they feared Sam Baxter's wrath if they showed her kindness. At Harriet Briggs's saloon, a small group of cowboys huddled around a pot-bellied stove. The sweetish smell of whiskey clung to their breath as they traded stories. The moment Mary walked in, eyes downcast and arms around a bundled infant, voices dropped. Harriet, wiping a glass with a rag, tilted her head. "Well, look who's come in from the cold," Harriet remarked, feigning a welcoming tone. "Mary Addison fancy seeing you alive after that storm. Guess the rumor's true." Mary mustered what courage she could. "Just need a place to sit for a moment. I have the babies with me." "No trouble." Harriet's gaze flicked to the back corner, where Sam Baxter himself sat nursing a tumbler of whiskey. He stared at Mary as though she were an insect trapped under his boot. Tension thickened the air. "Didn't expect to see you," Mary Baxter drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Heard the snow near swallowed you up." A half-smile tugged his lips, but it held no warmth. A shame that didn't come to pass. Mary clenched her jaw. Fear mingled with anger. She knew he felt entitled to the property that had once been her home, but never did she expect such open malice. This was a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The saloon door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air. And Jack Wilson. He took in the scene at a glance, Mary standing in the center of the room, Baxter staring her down, and a circle of cowhands on the periphery. Without hesitation, Jack strode to Mary's side. "Come on," he murmured. "You don't need to be here." Their eyes met. Mary saw the determination in Jack's gaze, a promise of protection if she just let him lead. She gave a slight nod, but as they turned to go, Baxter's voice cut through the hush. "Hold on there, stranger," Baxter said. "Don't think I've met you. Name's Sam Baxter. I own a fair bit of this town, including what used to be Mary Addison's land." Jack faced him, expression unreadable. "Jack Wilson. I'm just passing through." "Uh-huh. And you decided to pick up a stray widow and her brats on your way, did you?" Baxter's voice dripped with contempt. Anger flared in Jack, but he kept it in check. She needed help. Simple as that. Harriet smirked from behind the bar, anticipating a good story to spread. The cowhands watched eagerly, waiting for sparks to fly. Mary kept her head down, though her heart pounded. She feared any confrontation might unleash consequences she couldn't afford. Baxter stood adjusting his worn leather duster. He stood half a head taller than Jack, shoulders broad from years of ranch work. "Listen, I ain't one for fights in public, but you ought to know the property Mary's squatting on belongs to me now. She's got no claim to it. Best not invest your time or money in a lost cause." Jack stared back, refusing to be intimidated. "I'll invest my time in whatever I choose. If the lady and her children need help, I'll see to it they get it." A muscle in Baxter's jaw twitched. twitched. The saloon was so quiet, you could hear the wind moaning outside. Then Baxter gave a short, harsh laugh. "You got sand, stranger. I'll give you that. But watch your back." With that, he tossed back the rest of his whiskey, then slapped the glass on the bar so hard, Harriet winced. He stomped out into the cold boots crunching on the wooden porch. The tension lingered even after he left. Harriet cleared her throat, eyes darting between Jack and Mary. "Don't stir up trouble," she warned, not out of kindness, but self-preservation. "Folks around here don't like conflict." Jack ignored her. He placed a protective arm around Mary's shoulders and escorted her from the saloon. Once outside, Mary exhaled a shaky breath. "He won't just let this go," she said. "He wants me gone." Jack's eyes narrowed against the glare of the winter sun. "Let him try." Mary wasn't sure what startled her more, that Sam Baxter posed a mortal threat to her children, or that this quiet cowboy with honest eyes was willing to stand in his way. Either way, seeds of suspicion and fear were planted that day in Redwood Springs, and those seeds would soon bear dark fruit. Days turned into a week, and a week stretched into 2. The snow in Redwood Springs began to melt under a pale sun, revealing muddy streets and battered fences. Mary and her children settled into a meager routine at Chester Holloway's stable. Jack stayed nearby, occasionally sleeping in the loft or in a spare cot at the local blacksmith's workshop. Any place he could find that wouldn't draw Harriet Briggs's sneering commentary or Baxter's scorn. Despite the precariousness of their situation, Mary found small moments of warmth. Each morning, she'd feed and clean the triplets, who had grown a bit stronger each day. Little Joseph already flashed hints of a smile, while Jacob gurgled happily whenever Jack was around. And Rebecca, the only girl, seemed the calmest gazing at her brothers, with wise, curious eyes. One crisp afternoon, Mary ventured outside with the children to get some fresh air. Jack accompanied her, carrying baby Jacob in his arms. They walked along a short strip of land behind the stable, where a patch of snow was giving way to brown grass. "You're getting better on your feet," Jack observed softly, noticing Mary's steadier gait. She offered a thin smile. "Thanks to you, Maggie and Chester. If not for your help, Her voice trailed off, memories of the storm still fresh. "I owe you so much." Jack shook his head. "Don't fret about it. We all need help sometimes." Mary looked down, cheeks warming slightly. In the week since Jack saved her, she'd felt something grow in her chest, a stirring of gratitude, yes, but also a fragile seed of affection. She kept scolding herself for it. Grief over Frank's death still weighed heavily, and she had triplets to care for. She didn't have room in her life for romantic notions. Still, she couldn't deny the spark she felt when she caught Jack watching her or heard him laugh with the babies. Their moment of quiet was shattered by the sound of hooves clattering on the dirt road. Sam Baxter and 2 of his ranch hands appeared, eyes scanning the area. Mary tensed her grip on Joseph, tightening. Jack instinctively angled himself to shield Mary and the children. Baxter dismounted, hitching his horse to the stable's post. He took off his hat and slapped dust from the brim. "Afternoon," he said, faux politeness dripping from his words. Neither Mary nor Jack responded. They merely stared. "I'm here about some business," Baxter continued, directing his gaze at Mary. "I want to be sure you understand I don't hold nothing personal against you. It's just that your husband left debts, and I aim to collect." He pointed a thumb over his shoulder at the horizon. "I need that land. Spring's comin', and I'm fixin' to put in new cattle pens." Mary's heart raced. "That land was my home," she said. voice wavering. "Well, it ain't any more," Baxter snapped. Then he rolled his shoulders, feigning nonchalance. "I'll make you an offer. I'll give you $20 if you sign a paper saying you surrender all claims to the place. That's more than fair. Then you can leave Redwood Springs for good." Mary bristled. $20 was an insult, barely enough to get them to the next town with a roof over their heads. She looked to Jack, whose face had gone cold. "We're not interested," Jack said firmly. One of Baxter's men stepped forward, anger lighting his eyes, but Baxter lifted a hand, stopping him. He turned his attention to Jack. "You best be careful, boy. I'm not a man who's used to hearing no." Jack stared straight back, unflinching. "Could have fooled me." Baxter's hands curled into fists. "What's your stake in all this? You sweet on the widow, or are you just itching for trouble?" Silence lingered in the muddy yard. Mary's cheeks burned. Jack's mouth set in a grim line. At length he said, "My stake is making sure she's treated right. That's all you need to know." Baxter let out a harsh laugh. "A white knight, are ya? Well, you'll find this frontier's a far cry from those storybooks." He hawked and spat into the mud. "I'll give you one more chance. Mary, take the 20, or I'll make sure you regret refusing it." Mary lifted her chin. "I won't sign anything," she said, though her voice shook. "You can threaten me all you want, Sam Baxter, but I'm not leaving Redwood Springs." Something dark flickered in Baxter's eyes. "Then you've sealed your fate," he growled. Without another word, he turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and signaled his men to ride off. Mary sagged with relief once they were out of sight. She cast a sidelong glance at Jack. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't let him steal what little memory I have left of Frank." Jack nodded. "I understand. But Baxter won't stop. We need a plan." That evening they conferred with Chester and Maggie. The older couple suggested Mary appeal to the circuit judge, who occasionally passed through Redwood Springs. Perhaps there was a legal angle to dispute Baxter's claim. Chester even mentioned hearing that Wyatt Earp in his younger days had served as a lawman out in Kansas and might have some kin or acquaintances in the area who could lend legal advice. Mary felt a flicker of hope. If there was any chance to reclaim the land, or at least ensure Baxter couldn't oust her violently, she had to try. Jack volunteered to track down any lead on the circuit judge's next visit. For now, Redwood Springs was on edge, bracing for the next move from Sam Baxter. And Mary Addison found her heart torn between fear of the future and a cautious gratitude for the cowboy who refused to leave her side. Another week passed, and the winds shifted, warming the plains in an early hint of spring. The streets of Redwood Springs dried out, leaving behind ruts and patches of thick mud. Mary watched from the stable doorway as the snow receded, revealing patches of brown grass where her children might someday play. Each day, she grew more accustomed to Jack's presence. At first, she'd insisted on returning the money he spent on supplies, but Jack would always wave off her concerns. "Let's just say I'm investing in the future," he'd reply with a grin that made her blush. Slowly, Mary allowed the kindness to wrap around her like a shield against the harsh realities of frontier life. In the evenings, Maggie often cooked a simple supper over the forge beans bread. Maybe a bit of salted pork, enough to feed everyone. The triplets would lie swaddled in a corner, cooing and kicking their tiny feet. Jack took a special interest in them, singing softly or telling tall tales about wild mustangs and gold mines. Mary observed him with a mixture of awe and unease. She'd never known a man who took to children with such genuine affection, aside from her late husband. Yet there was a difference. Frank had loved her, but was often too burdened by the grind of survival to express tenderness so openly. One night after the triplets had finally nodded off, Mary and Jack stepped outside the stable for some fresh air. The moon was high, casting silver light over the plains. A few lonely wolf howls echoed from far off in the distance, mixing with the rustle of a mild breeze. Mary pulled her shawl tighter. "It's strange to think that just a few weeks ago I was sure my children and I were going to die in that storm," she murmured. "Every day since feels like borrowed time." Jack leaned against the stable wall, arms folded. "I've seen my share of storms," he said quietly. "Some of us come out the other side, stronger, different maybe, but still standing." He paused, then turned his gaze to Mary. "What do you want for your children's future?" She considered the question carefully. A chance, just a chance at something more than hardship. "I want them to laugh, to grow without fear. I want them to have a home, a place they can remember fondly when they're older." He nodded, a gentle understanding shining in his eyes. "I think every parent wants that. My folks were poor, but they did their best to teach me right from wrong, gave me a sense of honor. That's all a kid really needs, love and guidance." A hush fell between them. Mary's heart fluttered, and she swallowed hard. You'd make a fine father, Jack." "I can see it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. He looked away, a sudden tension creeping into his posture. "I never thought about having a family," he confessed. "I've been on the trail so long I don't know how to sit still." But he stopped, words caught in his throat. But what Mary prompted equally soft. He sighed. "But I'm starting to think maybe it's time I did. Being around you and the babies makes me feel like there's more to life than drifting." Emotions tangled within. Mary hope, fear, guilt for even thinking about another man after Frank's death. Yet she couldn't deny the growing bond she felt with Jack. Before she could reply, movement in the shadows caught their attention. Startled, they tensed. A figure approached, limping slightly. "Don't mean to interrupt," a gruff voice called. It was Bill Henderson, the blacksmith. He raised a hand in greeting. "I just came by to warn you Baxter's been sniffing around the shops, asking about you too." Jack straightened. "What's he want now?" Bill wiped sweat from his forehead, even in the cool night air. "Hard to say, but rumor is he's hired a couple more men, a gunslinger named Roy Red Dawson, and another fella who's known for breaking bones if he don't get what he wants." Mary hugged herself, suddenly feeling exposed. "So he's planning to force me out?" "That's the talk," Ma'am Bill said, sympathetically. "You two be careful." With that, Bill hurried off into the darkness, leaving Mary and Jack alone once more. The quiet that settled over them was no longer peaceful. It crackled with tension and unspoken fears. Mary glanced at the stable, imagining her 3 infants, sleeping blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked. She trembled at the thought of having no safe place to run if Baxter struck. Jack's jaw tightened. "We'll protect you, Mary. Somehow." She looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I know you will." Yet, deep down, she wondered how a single cowboy and a handful of kind townsfolk could stand against Baxter and his hired guns. The future of her children hinged on their next move. And in the West, blood often stained the ground before any real justice was served. A hush enveloped Redwood Springs as rumors of an impending confrontation circulated. Townsfolk started locking their doors at dusk, and Harriet Briggs's saloon grew quieter. Men no longer lingered to drink and chat for fear they'd be caught in the crossfire of Sam Baxter's vendetta. Late one afternoon, Jack returned from a brief trip to a nearby ranch, where, according to Bill Henderson, the circuit judge might be staying. He found no sign of the judge, only a vague promise from a ranch hand that the judge might pass through in a couple of weeks. Time was running out, and Mary and the children could not afford to wait. They needed a solution now. As Jack headed back into town, he caught sight of Baxter's men. Roy Red Dawson and another burly figure hitching their horses outside Harriet's saloon. Their eyes met Jack's with a sneer full of swagger. Jack swallowed a bolt of anxiety. This was a different league from the usual cowhands, men rumored to have quick trigger fingers and no conscience. Jack continued toward the stable, steeling himself for whatever might come. Mary was inside, cradling a fussy Rebecca. The little girl seemed to sense the tension in the air. Joseph and Jacob lay in a makeshift crib, eyes droopy with oncoming sleep. Maggie paced in the background, wringing her hands. When Jack walked in, Mary shot him a worried look. "Did you find the judge?" she asked, though her voice held little hope. Jack shook his head. "No sign of him. We've got to be ready for Baxter's next move. He's not going to sit around waiting for spring. He wants you gone." Fear flickered over Mary's features, but she managed a brave front. "Then I'll face him," she said resolutely. "If I have to stand my ground, I will." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden sound of hooves outside, lots of them. Jack and Mary exchanged a tense glance. Maggie peered through a gap in the stable's wooden doors and gasped. "It's Baxter and his men." Outside, Sam Baxter sat astride his horse, flanked by Roy Dawson and 2 other hired guns. Another half-dozen cowhands circled the stable, rifles and pistols at the ready. The townspeople peered from their windows, quickly shuttering them when they realized what was happening. Baxter dismounted and walked boldly to the stable door. He hammered on it with the butt of his revolver. "Come on out, Mary Addison, Jack Wilson. We got business." Inside, Jack's pulse pounded. He glanced at Mary. "Stay here with the babies," he whispered. "I'll talk to him." "No." Mary insisted, voice quavering but determined. "I won't hide behind you. This is my fight, too." Jack knew better than to argue. Together they stepped outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in stark contrasts of light and dark. Baxter stood arms crossed, while Roy Dawson fingered the hammer of his pistol. "You ain't paid your debt," Mary Baxter began, voice cold. "I'm here to collect." Mary set her jaw. "I have nothing left. You took my home, my land, everything but my children. You're still in Redwood Springs, breathing air." "That should belong to me," Baxter shot back, eyes narrowing. "I gave you a chance to leave. Now I'm done being nice." Jack stepped forward. "Hold on. We can sort this out." The circuit judge. Judge Baxter laughed a harsh sound. "Ain't no judge here now. But I've got my own brand of justice." He glanced at Roy Dawson, who sneered in anticipation. Roy drew his gun, leveling it at Jack. "Step aside, Cowboy, unless you want to dance with me." All around, the hired guns fanned out. A stillness settled on the street as the townsfolk hid behind curtains and shuttered doors. Jack stared at Roy Dawson, body tensed. "I don't want bloodshed. Let's settle this without killing." Baxter spat, stepping closer to Mary. "That's up to the widow. She signs away any claim to that land, takes $20, and disappears. Or we settle it here." Mary trembled eyes flicking to her children's silhouettes in the stable door. She refused to yield. "I won't sign," she managed, voice shaking but firm. In a flash, Roy Dawson's gun roared a warning shot that kicked up dust near Jack's feet. Jack darted sideways, hand twitching near his holster but still not drawing. He was a fair shot, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Another man raised his rifle toward Mary. Everything slowed. In that moment, Mary realized she couldn't let Jack fight this alone. If Baxter had his way, her children would be orphans. Fear crystallized into resolve. She darted forward, placing herself between Baxter and the stable heart, thundering. Suddenly a new voice rang out from behind the line of horses. "Put those guns down!" Baxter heads whipped around. Sheriff Jonathan Brown, one of the rare lawmen Redwood Springs had, and rarely seen, appeared flanked by Bill Henderson and a handful of concerned citizens. The small group was armed, though none looked like gunslingers. They'd rallied spurred by Bill's warnings. Harriet Briggs even stood at the saloon entrance, shotgun in hand, a stern expression on her face. It seemed Redwood Springs had chosen a side. A spark of rage flared in Baxter's eyes. "This ain't none of your business, Sheriff. The Addison land belongs to me." "That's for a judge to decide." Sheriff Brown cut in. "Until then, no vigilante justice in my town." Baxter's men eyed the sheriff's posse. They still held the numerical advantage, but with the sheriff involved, any bloodshed would carry consequences. Baxter's scowl deepened. He leveled a venomous glare at Mary. "You got lucky this time." Then he turned to Jack. "Next time I see you, Cowboy, we settle this. I ain't forgetting you cost me time and money." With that, Baxter and his posse backed off, mounting up and kicking their horses into a gallop out of town. A collective breath released across Redwood Springs. The crisis had ended, for now. Mary, heart pounding, reached for Jack. He steadied her relief washing over his face. For the moment, they were safe, but both knew Baxter would not rest until he got what he wanted. Still, something had changed. Redwood Springs had shown that it wouldn't stand idly by, and Mary Addison realized she was no longer alone in her struggle for survival, and neither was she alone in her heart. Spring unfurled across the plains, ushering in warmer days and a sense of renewal. The sheriff made it clear that any further trouble from Baxter would be met with a swift response. Though everyone knew Baxter wasn't the type to give up easily, the tension in Redwood Springs lessened enough for everyday life to resume. Mary spent her days caring for the triplets, who were now more active, Joseph and Jacob rolling and cooing, while Rebecca watched the world with her steady, curious eyes. Sometimes Mary caught herself imagining the children toddling across a green pasture, the sun warming their hair. She wondered if they would ever have a home to call their own. Jack, too, stayed busy. In the mornings, he helped Bill Henderson shoe horses or repair wagon wheels, earning a few dollars that he promptly used for supplies for Mary and the children. In the afternoons, he'd teach Mary small survival tricks, how to braid rope, how to mend tears in a saddle, how to patch a leaky roof. These simple lessons drew them closer, their conversations weaving a tapestry of dreams and shared burdens. One late afternoon, as gold light spilled over the stable yard, Jack approached Mary with an unusual shyness. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, glancing around to ensure they had some privacy. Maggie, keenly aware of the moment, ushered the triplets into her quarters for a short while. They stood by a broken fence post behind the stable, the sky streaked with pink and orange. Jack took off his hat and toyed with the brim, searching for the right words. "Mary, I've been thinking a lot about what's next. You and the children, you deserve better than living out of a stable. You deserve a place to call home." She swallowed, her heart beginning to flutter. "Jackie," he raised a hand gently. "Let me say this. I know you still mourn Frank, and I don't want to disrespect that. But I also know your children need a father, and, well, I'm willing to be that father if you'd have me." A soft gasp escaped Mary's lips. She'd suspected his feelings for some time, just as she felt her own shift from guarded gratitude to something deeper. But to hear it plainly moved her. Tears brimmed in her eyes. "Jack Wilson, are you asking me to—" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, voice trembling ever so slightly. "I don't got that much, but I've got 2 strong arms and a willingness to work. I'll build us a home, or fix up a homestead, or whatever it takes to keep you and the little ones safe." Mary felt her heart expand with an emotion she thought she'd never feel again. Hope. Fresh tears slid down her cheeks. "Yes," she murmured, her voice shaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." In that moment, the world seemed to glow brighter. Jack cupped her face in his hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her brow. Behind the stable door, Maggie peeked out, a wide grin on her face. Tears in her own eyes at the sight. They married a week later, in a simple ceremony at the old church in Redwood Springs. Sheriff Brown served as a witness, and Harriet Briggs, surprisingly touched by the romance, provided a modest wedding supper at the saloon, though she charged Jack half price, ever the businesswoman. Bill Henderson played a battered fiddle, and a handful of townsfolk gathered to share in the joyous occasion. The triplets, dressed in homemade gowns that Maggie sewed, gurgled happily throughout the service, as if blessing the union themselves. For Mary, the wedding was a second chance at life and love. She felt Frank's spirit watching over her, not with anger or jealousy, but with the peace of knowing his children would have the protector they needed. For Jack, it was the first time in his wandering life that he felt a sense of belonging. He wasn't just drifting. He was rooted now, bound by vows that he intended to keep to his last breath. Of course, Baxter's shadow still loomed, but for this one day, Mary and Jack refused to let fear overshadow their happiness. They danced in the saloon, swaying to the fiddler's tune, ignoring the hush that fell whenever the talk turned to Sam Baxter's inevitable retribution. They had each other, and they had hope, in the wild frontier that was more precious than gold. 2 days after the wedding, a telegram arrived in Redwood Springs, delivered to Sheriff Brown. The circuit judge would be passing through within a fortnight. With official legal proceedings imminent, Baxter would have to stake his claim in court rather than at gunpoint. And for the first time, Mary felt truly confident that justice might prevail. She stood with Jack at dusk that evening, the babies tucked into a wooden cradle inside the stable. The wind brushed her hair against her face, and she leaned into Jack's warmth. "What happens now?" she asked, half smiling. "We have a future that's uncertain." He kissed her temple softly. "Our future's ours to make Mary. And I reckon we're gonna make it a good one." In the final rays of sunlight, they laced their fingers together, stepping forward into a life where love, not fear, guided their path, and where the triplets, once left for dead in a blizzard, would grow up with every chance their parents could fight to give them. And so ends the harrowing journey of Mary Addison, a widow cast into the frozen wilderness, and Jack Wilson the cowboy, whose unwavering courage turned despair into hope. Their bond, forged in the harsh winds of the frontier, would become the foundation of a new life, one that promised a future for the triplets once left to fate's mercy. Against all odds, They stood together, proving that compassion and love can triumph over greed and violence. If this story moved, you don't let its echoes fade. Share it with friends who love a tale of frontier grit and redemption. Hit that like button to show your support and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that stirs the heart. Leave a comment to let us know what you thought, and remember, even in the darkest storm, hope can light the way forward.